All right, welcome to this episode of Shock Talk.
Shock Talk.
Shock Talk. I was going to bring my fake glasses.
Oh, that would be awesome. So we'd all be bald and wear glasses.
Yeah.
But I didn't see you were wearing glasses earlier today.
You're not ready to venture into this
I am.
adulthood.
All right,
I could barely see.
excited about this topic. So let's just try to approach it gingerly, right?
So yeah, I want to talk about why.
First off, what we're going to lightly touch on is why we as a company choose to valve some shocks digressive, valve some shocks linear, valve some shocks more of a linear fill with a digressive piston. So there's so much misconception in the marketplace that linear is the only way to go, that digressive is a cheap shock. And we're here to
Explain
why that's not the case.
Yeah,
and let's get a little background on why we wanted to talk about this. I'm sitting at home trying to go to bed, and I get an Instagram thing from Junior. What is that, a DM?
Oh, I slid into your DMs, man.
Yeah.
I slid right in there.
where there's somebody explaining.
Someone said there's 3 types of
Shocks.
Right.
One being progressive.
And then they held up some shock from China.
And then they said the other's linear. And then proceeded to give false information about both. And then stated that, and then there's a digressive shock.
And what did she say about the digressive shock?
They're typically all the cheaper shocks on the market.
Right.
Interesting.
So I think the place to start is, so we know it from our world, there's 2 basic types of dampers that we manufacture. We manufacture a digressive style, and we manufacture a linear style. And I think the best place to start for people is to say, what would be the major purpose or the application for each of those? Because I think that's what people would understand, right? So where would you use a linear type design shock and get the best performance? And where would you apply a digressive type design and get the best performance? I think that's how people would understand it.
And let's open this up with saying this is probably the most subjective topic.
Oh, it's taboo as hell. I mean, we have to be super
This is going to be the most subjective topic we talk about. Okay, so
but let's start there.
Let's start there.
Yeah.
So you want to know? Yeah, I mean,
well, let's talk about
typically people that talk shit about digressive valving or digressive damping
can't build them.
Can't build them.
Right. Or tune them.
Or they don't provide them. So if you're a damper manufacturer that just has linear pistons, of course they're going to be the best. And of course you're going to talk, down on digressive. People don't realize that a digressive piston is much harder to tune than a linear piston.
If we stick to the Bilstein world, right, from the outer space view, and we'll maybe let Shane or Junior speak to this. So what would be a good use case for a linear style?
I'm going to give you one.
Before we do that, what came first? History lesson.
History lesson.
What came first in damping technology?
In Bilstein world?
Anywhere. Linear piston?
You're going to have to answer that.
Was it a linear piston that came first?
Or
was it a digressive piston that came first, if you look back into history?
I would guess linear.
No, linear piston.
Yeah. Linear piston was the first type of deflective disc valving there was.
Right.
So these pistons, let's break down what it is. We're talking about deflective disc valving
on a linear piston.
Any piston. They're both going to.
This isn't one of those I don't want to cut down some brands. Let's say some twin tube shocks that are white. That are
right. We're working with monotubes
that have this 10-stage thing with a spring and all this crap. This isn't like that. This is deflective disc valving, and you have a rebound and compression side. Mm-hmm. Linear valving was the first style that was developed.
Okay.
And then they came out with digressive valving to
solve a problem.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And what was the problem?
The problem was that if you wanted handling with a linear piston and you wanted the vehicle to corner good, it would as soon as you hit something like a big impact, it would send the valving through the roof, and it would be super harsh.
So
Ramp
that's
up rate.
that's an
Yes.
attribute of a linear piston design is that if people know what a valving curve or a dyno curve looks like, it's basically straight lines on the rebound side, straight lines on the compression side. So there's no, we call it a potato graph. There's no roundness in the graph.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Okay, before we go ahead, force versus velocity curve.
Right.
So you've got an x-axis and a y-axis.
Right.
And on this, a linear basically stays linear. The faster you go,
The more valving comes in. Yep.
So that's how that works.
Right.
A digressive is a rising rate, and then it tapers off. So initially it gets stiff,
Right.
and then it levels off.
It reaches a peak and it levels off.
Which is why they make such great shocks for vehicles that drive on the road every day.
Daily
because
drivers.
no one's going to blow through their travel to get damping.
No,
Right, and
they're not.
the way it was explained to me is, so if you're driving around a parking lot at low speed, low rod input speed, the car's comfortable. But you get on the freeway and hit a bump at 60 miles an hour, and there's dampening there to keep you safe. That's the big benefit.
So here's how I got woke. Here's how I got woke.
Oh my gosh, I don't think I can address that.
I had a damper on my vehicle that was another manufacturer. This is way prior to me working here. It was a 2.5 inch shock. When I got into washboard fire roads, it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible.
What speeds were you traveling at?
As fast as the vehicle would go before it started rattling apart.
Right, 70, 80 miles an hour?
Yeah, well, I know 50,
Okay.
40, 50 miles an hour. I put on a 5100. It was literally so bad, I put a 5100 on there. And I started toying with tire pressure. What a night and day difference. Letting the tire take most of the impact while letting the damper take care of all that low speed, it's real low shaft velocity chatter.
Yeah.
Right.
You know what I mean? There's nothing like it. So you can get the best of both worlds out of a digressive piston as long as you're off-roading correctly.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's outfits like Icon Vehicle Dynamics. They tune digressive. It's all digressive. You know what I mean? Like their off-road shocks are digressive. We tune digressive. Most of Bilstein's off-road shocks, however, are linear piston. Right? We don't know what people are going to be doing.
I've noticed that most of the way I usually break it apart in my mind as far as Bilstein world is that, so most of our direct fit products are digressive and they're tuned vehicle specific, right?
Yes.
We want that absolute perfect ride for that vehicle, whether it's on the street or off-road, and we know what it is because we have it in here in our shop and our guys are driving around in it, so we make the perfect ride. I see linear pistons in our universal fit type product where we don't have a pinpoint nailed down exactly what vehicle it's going to go on. So speak to that. Why would we put linear pistons in universal?
Most of our universal stuff are for light truck applications, and if a guy can't find a fitment if it's a farming truck or something, like you put this shock on there and it's going to do nothing at low velocity. It's not perfect. Here's a good thing. In the 60s and 70s, you know, before digressive pistons were really a thing, it was all linear. This is why the Buick Regals and the Cadillacs and the road.
They rode so good.
No valving. I wouldn't say good.
Yeah.
I would say they had no control.
Right.
You'd get these things on the R52 freeway by the junkyards, and they would literally, you would hear the tires re-hitting the ground.
They'd leave the ground.
Correct. So here's the biggest thing I think we need to explain to the market is you can't confuse firmness for control.
Right.
If you have a car that you haven't done shocks on in 150,000 miles, and you put a digressive piston on there and you came from a real low pressure twin tube type
Worn
damper,
out. Yeah.
it's going to change your ride drastically.
Yep.
Not stiff. It's not going to be stiff. It's going to be controlled.
Right.
And I think
Whereas you were used to 150,000, well, let's say 50 or 60,000 miles of an uncontrolled suspension,
Right, yeah.
uncontrolled suspension movement.
Right.
Yeah, you hear that a lot on, especially like on Jeep forums.
Yeah.
People are like, Bilsteins are stiff. It's not that they're stiff. It's that they're controlled.
Right.
Right.
You took off an old worn out shock. You put on something
The
that's
purpose of a
working
shock
properly.
absorber is to control kinetic spring energy. If you're used to that kinetic spring energy not being controlled, our shocks are stiff. If you want the control to slow that kinetic spring energy down the way it should be slowed down, then you'll understand how a vehicle suspension performance should operate. And this is why some of the top tier racers in Germany and Europe and stuff choose our brand, because it controls the ride. And a controlled ride doesn't mean that you don't feel the bumps and the chatter in the road. Doesn't mean that at all.
It actually means that you get a little bit more sensitivity.
A little more feedback.
Yeah, a little
you get
bit
a little
more
more feedback, right?
feedback. The way it was. Go ahead.
So it's like it's kind of a preference thing, but
100%.
but like for linear, we use linear for off road, right? Because usually you've got a cage, especially for off road racing. You're not
Right.
dealing with all this chassis flex
And
and all this weird stuff with a body on frame car.
safety is not an issue, like you said.
Not an
You're in a
issue.
cage. You got
And
helmet.
this is where that ramp up rate
Yeah.
comes into play.
yeah.
You're jumping off a 3-foot shelf. You want that
You
ramp
want
up
that
rate.
ramp up rate.
Yeah, so with an off road tune, usually like the low speed is really light,
Yep.
and what happens is
Keeps the car connected to the ground.
But what also happens is when you go around a corner, you're leaning.
Little
Yeah.
body roll.
You're leaning. You're
Body roll, yep.
when you hit the brakes, you're brake diving. When you hit the gas, you're going up.
Which people expect in an off-road race car.
And you're just not really like what you want to do is when you impact a big bump, you want it to suck it up. So linear is not good for that because it will ramp way up.
But why would you want that on a street car? On a street driven car? Say I'm building a 4Runner. We always go back to 4Runner. Say I'm building a 4Runner.
What about
why
an
would I want my
LC100?
why
think
would I
you
want my
secretly
vehicle?
want a 4Runner.
Why would I want my vehicle to behave like you just stated on the road?
You wouldn't.
Well, you wouldn't.
And that's what I was going to say is I think that the main driving force behind digressive valving was safety. I
It
think
is.
that a lot of
Well,
it has
well,
to do.
Well, you'll also notice that on Bilstein kits that we, on Bilstein coilovers or Bilstein 6112s, a lot of people say, "Hey, you use a lighter rate spring than our competitors." Well, they're also using a linear piston, so they're counting on spring rate to
Right,
avoid
to help control
corner
it.
dive,
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So they're reliant on overspringing a vehicle to make a linear piston work and be suitable.
Safe and feel good.
Whereas we can drop the spring rate 100 pounds, get the ride compliant, use a digressive piston.
Use the valving to control.
Yeah.
it.
Right. Use the valving
Rather
to
than the
control
spring.
that energy rather than all in spring rate. And then in order to control that additional spring rate, it's got to be damped heavier.
Yeah.
Well,
And-
let's clear something up. So,
Sure.
so if you want to take a linear piston and you want to have control in that area where there's body motion, brake dive, and things like that, a linear piston means like this is what we call a low velocity kind of movement where the chassis is kind of moving around. You're not impacting it. You're not sending a lot of like high speed impacts or inputs into that. So you're leaning. So if you want to control that lean with a linear piston, what happens? You need that valve curve to go up quickly, right? To control that. But what happens when you hit something hard?
It's going to be super
Yeah,
stiff.
it's going to break the frame in half.
It's going to send the valving through the moon.
Right.
So with that digressive valving, it tapers off at a certain point and allows the suspension to move. So it gives you that control in that area. But when you impact something hard, it blows off.
Right.
Which most street applications aren't going to be at the bottom end of their travel,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Now,
So
go ahead.
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say something that ties into this that I get a lot of questions about, and I'm sure both of you guys probably do as well. So we're getting into the realm of velocity sensitive talk right now, so we might as well explain that, right? So Shane was talking about low-speed rod inputs versus high-speed rod inputs.
Yes.
Now we probably should relate that to low-speed inputs in linear systems and low-speed inputs in digressive systems versus high-speed in either one of those as well, or velocity-sensitive type stacks. So let's explain that for the people real quick.
So the low velocity is kind of where the handling brake dive, like we said. The digressive piston will ramp up quickly to control that.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to have more control stability with a digressive piston. So for high speed, the digressive piston is going to blow off at a certain point.
And not at high
not at vehicle speed.
High vehicle speed, high shaft velocity.
Shaft velocity.
Rod input, yeah.
When you hit something at a high shaft velocity, the valve curve basically flatlines and tapers off.
Right.
So that the wheel moves. So it doesn't like send the teeth through your brain.
So your bump stops can do what they should do.
Exactly.
You know?
You can see how much air you really have in your tires.
Where if you envision a linear curve, the linear curve at the low velocity isn't providing much damping. You're getting body roll.
No support,
No support. And we'll talk about this maybe in a second, all the NVH and all the vehicle shake and stuff like that. So that maybe we'll move that.
Save that for another episode?
No? Maybe a little bit. Or do we want to talk about that now?
Talk about it.
Let's talk about it now. Okay, so when you have a body on frame, chassis, truck, typically, there's not just, like we're dealt a certain spring rate from the manufacturer or a lift kit manufacturer, front and rear. But there's a lot of stuff going on, especially with a pickup truck. When you've got a cab, you've got a bed,
frame flex,
you've got body mounts, you've got all this stuff. So we typically call it shake. Mm-hmm. The vehicle's shaky. That's the tuners are always like combating shake. And what that is this, like when you're driving down the road and maybe you're going 50 miles an hour.
The lack of isolation.
Yeah. There's the vehicle. Like if you have lack of low speed damping.
Yeah, it's a non-suspension related frequency movement.
Exactly. The chassis and everything is shaking.
But it's not the suspension causing the shake. It's everything bolted to it.
A little bit.
Well, I mean, like it could be anything. I mean, the minute there's any input, it's the suspension that's driving the chassis to do what it's doing.
Right.
So if you just kind of allow the wheels to move around and that low speed character with a linear valving, what's going to happen a lot of the times is you can't control this NVH, this vehicle shake, and this just chassis movement. So the digressive valving does a really good job at tuning that out. Because it's like, it's not allowing the wheels to just freak out and move wherever they want. Mm-hmm. You know, you're tuning that up. I've been on a one tuning session with a late model Ram truck where actually on the low speed, changing the low speed with the digressive valving, doing a valve change, the seat would shake. And then we'd go back and then the seat would stop shaking. So it's like the digressive valving for tuning the vehicle for drivability on the road with all this vehicle shake and all this movement is way more effective and makes the vehicle way more comfortable to drive than a linear piston.
Way safer, because you have all the low speed control.
So it's not that we want it to be soft. Of course we want it to be comfortable.
Right.
But there's a certain point where you've given a vehicle.
It's control versus, it's control. I think in the consumer's mind, it's comfort versus control. And the whole thing about comfort can get away from you really quickly.
Right. And become unsafe.
Whereas control, I'm not sure unsafe, but it can get away. So you can change the driving character. This is why everyone says, the driver says, the Bilstein's transformed my ride. The commuter says, this made my car stiff.
Yeah. Well, the commuter that had 100,000 miles on their original shot.
Well, the commuter wants to sit in a recliner and listen to this podcast in an hour of traffic.
Right. And the driver wants to feel connected to the road. Right.
The driver wants to take that chassis and maximize what it's intended for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is the reason why we've gotten into this topic quite a bit. So you get into what's a rear wheel drive Japanese car? An IS 350. You get into an IS 350, great chassis, great car, reliable, fast, not tuned very well. Okay.
Like a big couch on 4 wheels?
No, I mean, it's probably their sportiest vehicle they have for the mainstream market. But you get into a BMW 328 run-of-the-mill car, and you go carve corners with this the quote-unquote sportiest vehicle that Lexus makes, you're losing him.
Yeah.
Because the chassis dynamics are just different.
Right.
Right? And part of that is choice of dampers. You know what I mean? Like it's
Yep.
It's how much you want your car connected to the road. Look, if you guys want it to drive like a 1992 Roadmaster, go find a linear shock. If you want to be connected to the road and make sure that tire's constantly contacting the road, you need a digressive piston.
Yeah.
You need something that's going to give you that feel. You know, this is the difference between a driver and a commuter. Do you want to drive your car, or do you want your car to drive you?
Yeah, and I just got asked a question at a recent trade show. So, and it's related to this topic. So we make a very high performance, let's call it almost off-road racing, but it's a direct fit product, an 8112 DSA, right? So it's a direct fit, super high performance off-road shock, right?
8112.
8112. What kind of piston is in that damper?
That's a digressive piston.
Digressive piston, right? So back to this question again. So where does
I challenge any linear piston against that shock.
Yeah, well, I do as well. But where does the linear piston like come into its own? Like I have a linear piston right here on the table. This is out of one of our off-road racing shocks. This actually, it works well in some cases. What would be one of those cases?
Racing.
Off-road
racing.
Right.
Racing.
Like the car on the wall there.
That's seeing super high shaft velocity constantly.
Right.
Well, like on an off-road race car, you kind of want it to lean.
Right.
Kind of want it
Right.
to brake
Right.
drive.
Right.
You want it to lean into a corner to a certain extent.
Right.
So that it could get her, so the tires can dig
Yeah.
into the corner.
Right.
And push you around. And usually you're in a 2-track, right?
And so it's going to hold you.
Yeah. So you're not really like, I mean, handling obviously is a big issue, but it's not like on the street where you have a vehicle that corners flat.
So here's my next question. Why wouldn't you use a digressive piston in an off-road racing car? Is there anything that says you can't?
There's nothing that says you can't.
It's a little more. It's a little more difficult to tune, to dial it in.
Correct. It would definitely be harder on the tuning
Yeah,
side.
yeah. I mean, and if it's doing what an off-road car, if the intent of the linear piston targets what the off-road car is doing, why?
The main thing with an off-road car
The
is
linear piston is typically being trailered to an event,
Right.
to a race.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So it gets like Shane said, you know, a lot of these guys, to avoid flats, are running 30 PSI in their tires.
Right.
So they don't want additional low velocity damping. They don't need it.
I guess my question, to narrow it in a little bit more, so what's the performance advantage with a linear piston on the off-road car?
In an off-road car, you're going over gigantic bumps. And
Constantly.
you need to, and
that
you need
off-road
to,
car is not going to be on the street.
Right.
and the main goal there is to be able to soak up the gigantic bump.
So the linear graph, which we will show at some point, works better for that.
I wouldn't
type
say
of
better.
driving.
I would challenge us, if what you're talking about is the Blackhawk UTV,
Mm-hmm.
I believe with that technology, having JCO, RCO, we could probably put a digressive piston in there and get the shock to behave very similar.
Because you have the high speed at the end
Right.
stops.
Right.
So in the 8112, we use a digressive piston that gives you the great isolation
Right.
that we want
Mhm.
and the good road manners, but we don't have to have the knee up there very high.
Yeah.
We don't have to, we can detune the piston for not having to control a high speed impact
Right.
and rely on the end stop controls for the high speed impacts.
Right.
That's the beauty about the 8112. So the digressive piston works great for that because you have the isolation you want with the chassis. You've got good control. You can have a lighter spring rate, but the end stop is the
Controlling
equalizer.
It's controlled, right. JCO, RCO controls end.
So, but if you just have one piston and you need the, and your goal is to have maximum control when you hit something super hard in an off-road vehicle,
Linear is the way to go.
the linear is the way to go.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, it's always, I mean, it's just like we said at the beginning of the episode, we've dealt with it for so long at trade shows, and there's always this constant battle. And of course, this is just our opinion. This is Bilstein's opinion.
Again,
I'm
the most subjective conversation we're going to have is this here today.
Right.
And it's not everyone's right way, but Bilstein, as everyone knows, has been very successful.
Yeah, we've perfected it, I think.
And I tell people all the time that that a digressive piston's not for everyone. It's not for everyone. If you're a twin tube damper guy coming into a monotube digressive type damper, it might not be for you. So what kind of driver are you? Are you a commuter? Are you a driver?
Yeah.
Right.
I think that, like, we talked about this for a second earlier. The digressive piston is way more advanced and way harder to tune if you don't know what you're doing. So you brought that up at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
There's some companies that just do linear. You can go to most off-road shock tuners and hand them a digressive piston. They won't know anything about it.
Yeah, they don't know what they're looking at.
But let's clear this up. So a linear piston has got its limitations on how you can tune it. And let's just say it. We call these linear pistons and digressive pistons, right? Mm-hmm. But really, it's a curve. With our digressive piston, you can tune and make them linear.
Feel, right?
Yeah. You can make it feel like a linear.
You could tune it with a linear curve. You could tune it with a digressive curve.
Mm-hmm.
So it's way more tunable, and you can do a lot more stuff with a Bilstein digressive piston as far as getting the damping curve you want than a linear piston. Just 100%.
Just more options.
There's a lot more options.
Limited, yeah.
And this is another reason people say progressive. Progressive isn't a piston. It's the way it was valved.
Well, the only time
the
I hear
curve.
progressive,
It's the curve.
yeah,
it's the damp. It's the damping stack that you chose to put on there is progressive. There's only a linear and a digressive piston.
Progressive lives.
There's
in
no
the,
progressive.
lives in the
Progressive
spring
is a
world.
style curve.
Well,
Yes.
they do make progressive springs, and I think sometimes people may confuse progressive spring rate.
But it is a damping curve.
It's a
Right.
damping curve. It's a
Right.
progressive damping curve.
Right.
It's not a progressive piston. There's
No.
a linear and a digressive.
Correct. Yeah.
It's
It's all a damping curve.
a damping curve.
And a Bilstein digressive piston, you can easily do a linear. You can do a digressive curve, a linear curve. I don't know if you can do a progressive curve.
And it's not. I would just have more respect for guys rather than just saying that digressive sucks. Just to be honest and say, hey, I don't know how to tune the digressive piston.
right,
Yeah.
right.
You know what I mean? Because that's where it
Because
boils.
done
that's
right,
what
it works
boils down
really,
to.
really well.
Because I've known tuners like Wes. I've known tuners like Nathan that can take a digressive piston and make it behave linear.
Yeah,
Of course.
absolutely.
So rather than just saying the piston sucks and let's swap it over to a linear piston, it is in my eyes is showing the level of skill you have rather than stating facts or stating an opinion. Just state you're not comfortable valving a digressive piston. I don't think I'm going to be able to get your vehicle to behave the way it should, the way you want it to with a digressive piston. So let's swap over to a linear, which I'm more comfortable valving.
Which you have, maybe they have more experience with the linear setup, or again, this is our wheelhouse. The digressive piston is our wheelhouse. So
Not
there's
necessarily
gonna
because
linear is our wheelhouse too.
Linear is our wheelhouse.
Yeah.
man.
But
I mean, every 7100 series shock that's been
Yep.
off road since the 70s have been linear.
Yeah.
Like we said,
Still are.
The digressive was to solve a problem, probably with road racing or street cars, right?
right, right.
Is the linear just has the linear piston with a linear curve. You just can't control the vehicle very good.
You do find linear piston dampers on street race cars as well. I mean, we have a motorsports division. They do a lot of asphalt and dirt racing, and you find linear pistons in those shocks as well. And it's just a matter of tuning.
That's a motorsports thing, and
Right.
most of those are linear. But I'm talking about,
And you're also talking to professional.
I'm talking about tuning out
right.
chassis feedback, steering feedback. As Shane was saying, chassis shake that results from and
Body on frame.
Body on frame. And I'm going to just tell you, the longer you get a chassis, the more frame flex and
flex,
stuff that
yeah.
you're going to get. So
Double cab truck.
if you're out there with a crew cab long bed F350, put a digressive shock on there.
Yeah.
That's your best chance.
Yeah.
That's your best chance.
Towing.
Yeah.
Towing's a
Yeah.
huge
Yeah.
thing for Digressive
Towing.
Pistons.
Towing.
Yeah.
Like anyone that's towing 40, if your vehicle stock, put a 4600 on it. It'll transform the way the vehicle handles with tongue weight on there.
Yeah.
Right? 5100 if it's lifted. It's just there's
Like a 6-inch lift on
we can't be this successful today if what the public is saying is true. If Digressive sucked, Bilstein wouldn't be as successful as they are. So let's reiterate what you guys are saying. Let's speak fairly and just say that I'm not comfortable with digressive valving. I'm not comfortable tuning a digressive piston rather than it sucks, because it 100% has its place in the market.
Oh yeah.
Like-
I have a dealer right now. He's a King guy, an absolute King guy. Like he's in bed with King. He finally got the
In bed.
opportunity
Yeah.
in bed,
Yeah.
in bed with digressive damping
Yeah,
in the mattress. So check this out. So Kings were back order. This is like right in the middle of, like in the beginning, middle of COVID. Back order. So he's like, forget it, man. I'm just going to do an 8112. He was in absolute awe. And the person he sent these shocks to had a hers and his 4Runner. His was already done with Kings. Hers was a new build. Couldn't get the Kings. Couldn't get him. So he sent him 8112s and 8100 bypasses. He got a message the next day after they were installed and a video of these things racing down the same road in Las Vegas, a whooped out, beat down road, and how the 8100s were just walking away from it. Ride comfort, everything. He drove it. He's like, this is unbelievable. This is cutting edge technology for bolt-on coilovers. This is exactly what he said. And if you guys want me to, I can have him on as a guest speaker.
I wanted to clarify one thing before we move on, or whatever we're going to do next. Is we talk a lot about curves, right? And people are going,
Look at them.
yeah, what
Look
the
at 'em. They're
heck
right
are
here.
you talking about, right? So
From head to toe.
to explain, we're talking about a dyno curve. So that is a graph that's created in our computers when we run a shock on a dyno at a certain speed. So it makes a curve or a graph. So those of you that didn't understand that part about curves, we're not talking about Junior's curves. We're talking about dyno curves here that are created in our computers.
Very low shaft velocity, then higher shaft velocity,
Yep.
then
Do you know what we should do on this episode? We should do like maybe do the Tundra, right? Tundra 5100 curve.
Oh, yeah.
And then show the 8112 curve, and like kind of you can like on the dyno
and the 8112 curve is a digressive piston. So you can see how when it enters its jout stage,
Yep.
how it behaves super linear,
Yep.
Yeah.
right? And then how exponentially damping ramps up.
Yep.
Yeah,
Like
Yeah,
it
it's
goes into
pretty
like,
dramatic.
what is like 15,000 newtons of force
triples.
In the JCO.
in the
high
JCO.
stage, yeah.
In the first stage of the JCO,
yeah.
it gets into the 14,000 newtons of force range.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
So yeah, I want to bring up like digressive. You brought up lifted truck for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just tell a story back in history. Remember back in 6-inch lift Chevy pickup days. So Bilstein, this was the infancy of the 5100. Probably one of the first 5100s we did
Oh yeah.
for a lifted truck was the 6-inch Pro Comp kits, right? Back
RCD.
not RCD, before Pro Comp. So
Right.
the swing set steering,
The steering drop bracket.
the steering drop back before RCD.
So this is square body.
No. 88 through 98 before RCD.
Right, square body. 88 through 98. Yeah, square body.
OBS.
Yeah. Square body,
OBS.
OBS.
So OBS Chevy or GMC with a Pro Comp hanger kit that also dropped the upper control arm, dropped the steering.
Oh,
So all
talk
the
about
shocks
walking on tippy toes.
Yeah. Remember how bad those things were?
Oh,
Like, so we brought the vehicle in to do the ride work. Bilstein does specific testing on all of our
Vehicle tuning.
Vehicle
on every
tuning.
application we make.
And typically it's a digressive valve if it's road going. So anyways, first truck, 35s, Pro Comp kit, the Nightmare
Swing
set, lower control, the upper control arm dropped, lower control arm dropped.
And this is the one that uses the factory steering knuckle. So your everything is just pushed down and just leveraged.
With a strut thing. Remember? The strut thing.
To keep the wheels from doing this.
Yeah.
Anyways, I remember driving this truck and I thought the thing was
falling
going
apart.
to fall apart.
100%.
Fall apart. It's like this thing is like on its last legs. It's
And it was
falling
brand
apart. It's shaking. Like everything's loose. Okay. Fast forward a couple days later. Lou,
Right.
it was our great shock tuner that we had back in the day. Digressive tuned 5100 series.
Change the game.
Felt like a new truck.
Felt like a new truck.
Yep.
Because the digressive piston was controlling
All the
not only the
slop,
low
yeah.
speed damping, but all of the slop, all the movement, all this stuff moving around down there
The swing set.
was being isolated by the digressive curve.
Yep. Yep.
And it's like, it's an amazing technology.
God,
Matter of
that
fact,
kit- you know,
it's
that
patented.
That kit's still made too. Like, why?
Do they still make that?
Yeah, a lot of companies do. I think CST still makes.
Yeah,
the
CST
control
makes
arm
it,
kit. I think ProComp still makes it. No,
Nobody makes like the full upper control arm drop kit, right?
I think Trailmaster does.
Trailmaster's not even around.
Yeah,
Are you sure?
they're owned by 4 Parts.
Yeah, when we say pre-RCD, let's explain that really quick. So somewhere in the
2001,
2000s,
2002, yeah.
all of the IFS lift kits had
Swing
a
set,
dropped
yeah.
upper and lower control
Where you
arm.
had to basically cut the factory frame
Yeah.
to drop the control arm, and it kept the factory steering knuckle. It dropped the factory steering onto 2 pivots
Into a swing set.
into
Yeah.
a swing set.
Yeah.
And
we
not
call
a
it
very
swing
good
set
quality.
Right.
and we call it a swing set because it
It swings around.
and
It
it
looks like
had
a
so
swing
many
set.
bars under it. It
Yeah.
looked like you were driving by a child's park.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
then
usually they were
remember-
painted like yellow.
And then on top
Bright
of it,
red.
they dropped the torsion housing,
Yeah.
which made the torsion bars almost touch the ground.
Right.
So you could literally swing from one torsion bar to the other
Right.
if you were a guy your height, Mike.
So you said, yeah. So, I mean, I love
So,
swinging
so
around in a
it's
truck.
not only a hanger kit, but it's a hanger swing set
Yeah.
kit.
So we had that mess. You mentioned RCD. What
So
did they do to
what did
correct it?
RCD, very ingenious. They did do the hanger kit. They dropped the lower control arm, but they made a new knuckle,
Right.
A long knuckle.
a long knuckle.
And they left the upper control arm.
the upper control arm
Stayed in
and
stock
the upper
location.
control arm itself.
Right. And
was
we,
stock.
and we put a longer shock in.
A longer shock. But you also you moved the steering up, so now you don't have to change the steering.
Well, you didn't move
Right.
the steering at all. You just left the steering where
We
it
left
is.
it in its original.
but on the spindle,
Spindle, you move the tie rod angle,
Yeah.
the tie rod mount
Yeah.
up on the steering knuckle.
so they were the first ones to do a lift kit with
A steering knuckle.
with a steering knuckle.
Right. Which
And
was
it-
groundbreaking.
Yeah, that's Jim Asbury
Yep.
and RCD, and it was groundbreaking.
Yeah.
And it changed the whole industry.
But it also did a lot that we didn't like. I mean, if we're being fair. So
Well, compared to swing set,
compared to swing set, it was great, but it also increased track width in the front.
but it looked cooler.
Yeah.
Well, not if you had a minimal amount of offsets available in an 8 on 6.5,
On the 15
and
inch
you were
rim.
doing a 2500, and there was only a 4.5 inch backspace wheel available for it, and you were putting a 35 on it, and the whole tire stuck outside the fender. You know what I mean? So there was, and then they started doing CST, and all these other manufacturers started getting involved in actually making welded upright knuckles full length, right? So then there's when the real technology started kicking in, is when the fabricated knuckle guys started saying, hey, I could fabricate this and like lessen the track width. But right, you're right. Jim changed the game
So-
in 6-inch lift kits.
Staying on the topic of valving, what type of valving did we put in the damper that we did a private label product for that kit, I believe, right?
Everything was digressive valving
Right.
because you had a road going vehicle.
Right.
You had a bunch of stuff going on with a lift kit. You had big tires.
Right.
You had heavy wheels. You needed digressive
So it was
to
a
control
vehicle
that.
specific tune. Like we said, it was probably a private label shock that went with that kit, and it rode great.
Yeah. I mean, I like linear. Off-road, rides great, smooth, but you're not really dealt. Like, you got to deal with what you got with the manufacturer. You can't just choose a spring rate.
Right.
Make the spring rate softer, especially with torsion bars.
You know, Shock Surplus did a very good video with Jeff's truck. Had a Chevy. He went over a speed bump by the shop. He put 5100s on there. They've tested every shock on this truck. The truck's
probably lucky WLI.
Yeah. So the Rancho stock shock went over the speed bump, oscillated 3 or 4 times before it settled down.
Now that's a twin tube, right? Or was that a monotube Rancho?
I believe it's monotube.
Monotube, okay.
I believe it's monotube.
Rancho and Tenneco.
But it's a linear piston.
How do you know?
Okay.
I'm certain.
Okay. Did you?
Okay. They do. Tenneco does have digressive pistons.
Right, but the range. This was a linear piston, so it hits. I should say I'm 99.7% sure.
Just
so
based on how it worked.
Just based on how it operated.
Right.
So it hit there and it oscillated 3 or 4 times. Put a 5100 on there with a digressive piston. Hit the same bump. Same speed bump. Soaked it up. Came up one time and
settled. Yeah.
Like, that's what I mean by control versus. That's what I mean by driver versus commuter.
Right.
The commuter isn't going to mind the oscillating because it's soft.
He wants to be on the couch.
Right. It's soft. It comes up over it. And the Bilstein comes up over it. Just a piston change. Really.
Yeah. And
they're both 2-inch shocks.
Yeah, but I mean our tuners tuned it, right?
Yeah, but I think more or less the digressive piston makes it behave that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it recovers itself so much better. Right? If we would have put a linear piston in that, we could have tuned the heck out of it, and I think it would still give that oscillating function.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that like the chassis stiffness has a lot to do with it too.
True, like a boxed frame versus a non-boxed frame.
Like take an XJ Cherokee. That's a pretty stiff chassis.
Right.
Well, it's a unibody.
Right.
But it was pretty like stout. Like
it was so stiff. I broke the fiberglass doors a few times flexing.
But that with a XJ Cherokee, that worked really good with a linear piston.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
And a flutter stack. The flutter stack on the XJs worked great.
So now you guys are starting to get into our next episode, which is we're going to take apart these valving systems and we're going to talk about the individual pieces. But, you know, to keep our listeners on the edge of their chairs, we're going to make them come back for another episode on valving.
We're just going to get a little deeper dive into it. I mean, we don't want to get over anyone's head, but we want to take a little deeper dive into, you know, some of our check valves that we use, you know, just on digressive pistons. Some of how, you know, how bleed shims operate, how base and preload. Yeah, kind of makes the biggest difference within a valving change.
Let's talk about those things you hear: bleed, flutter stack. What's that? What's preload?
Yeah.
Like those are all of those terms.
They're all coming up. So if you
we're going to do it as gracefully as possible so that everyone understands it.
Yeah. So again, we're going to hold that stuff for our next episode, and we want to give you a little forewarning that in that next episode is going to be a little bit more visual, so that if you are a listener, not a watcher, perhaps you'll want to save the second half of the valving episode for a time where you can sit and watch it. And we hope you enjoyed our entry to digressive and linear valving, and we hope that you'll come back and join us for a little bit more in-depth into the working parts of those two systems.
And digressive and linear piston.
Yes.
Not valving. See, my brain has already stopped working due to lack of food.
My curves are still here.
Your curves are still here. Thanks for joining us. We hope you come back and see us for the next episode.